Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and if you watched my video last week, you may recall that I said that in the very near future, we'd be talking about Youngblood Strikefile. Well, the future is now. Unless you're watching this video several years from when I upload it, in which case this is the distant past. But regardless, today we're going to be talking about Youngblood Strikefile number 1. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in April of 1993, we can see here Chapel is featured front and center on the cover, this image by Jay Lee, who also did the interior artwork. And it's a cool cover. I do have a few complaints about what goes on inside of the book, but we'll get into that once we actually look inside. However, I'd like to point out that there's also a gold foil cover for this book that looks like this. As you can see here with the covers side by side, the only real difference is the fact that the Youngblood Strikefile logo and the Image Comics logo are now gold foiled. However, there is one other slight difference, and I don't know if this had to do with the way that the foiling process is done, but you may notice that there's slightly more page above the gold foiled logo than there is the non-foiled logo. There's a little bit of just extra space up here. Now, this may, of course, had to do with the fact that if you tried to do the gold foil this close to the top of the page, it wouldn't work right, or perhaps it was just like a mild printing error. I don't know, but you will notice that the gold foil over here is right on the edge of the spine, whereas here it's not. It's, again, not a major difference, and it doesn't really have that drastic of an effect on anything. It was just something I wanted to point out to everybody. Creator, plot, Rob Liefeld. Pencils, inks, Jay Lee. Script, Rob Liefeld, Eric Stevenson. Color design and separations, Steve Oliff and Ollie Optics. Lettering, Kurt Hathaway. Editor, Eric Stevenson. The book starts out with a story that is being told by Chapel in the current age of 1993, but this story takes place about 6 years before that. So it features Chapel, Al Simmons before he died, and a man we only know by the name of Duke. And they've been sent to take out a secret safe house that is under the control of an organization known as Cybernet. Now, this is the first time we've actually heard of this organization, and I don't know if this is something that would later go on to have some sort of an affiliation with Cyber Data that we know of in the Cyberforce comic books. Possibly, I don't know. It's not really told in any kind of descriptive capacity. What we do know is that the CIA seems to not want Cybernet to exist, so they sent Chapel, Al, and Duke to go take out this safe house, which they do very willingly, although Chapel notes during this recanting of this mission that the whole thing kind of did feel like a setup from the beginning, so they decided to, instead of sneak their way in through the back, just kick down the front door and take on whatever droves of enemies or adversaries may have been there, as we see Chapel opening fire here and blasting a few of the enemy combatants completely in half. And you may notice that this book is doing one of the things that generally makes me the most upset, in the fact that none of these panels have backgrounds, and most of the panels will not have backgrounds, as you will see when we get further into this story. We see here as the team encounters some enemy guards that the guards themselves are much more cybernetic than they are human, some of them looking as if they're almost entirely robotic at this point. And the team makes short work of them, as Chapel states that he's basically positive at this point that this is a setup, given that there was almost no resistance, and after the first few guards they took out, they were essentially able to just walk straight up to the front door of this place and place an explosive charge on it and blow it straight open. As soon as Chapel kicks the door down, they are immediately greeted by an entire drove of enemy guards, which confirms everything he believed from in the first place. And now he knows that he and his two associates are going to have to fight their way through this to take out the enemy threat. Also, again, notice very few, if any, backgrounds. We have some silhouetted buildings here, what appears to be a wall, but there's only like one line of detail on it. And while we do have the wall that is attached to the door that Chapel's kicking in, The skyline behind him shows literally nothing. It's just colors and shades. We then get a big 2-page splash image in which Chapel recants that despite the fact they were up against overwhelming odds, they didn't care too much and knew for a fact that they were more than capable of dealing with the challenge in front of them, as all three men immediately draw their guns and open fire, just blasting away. And we notice that, all of these guns look super weird. They're more like gun-ish objects, including Chapel's with this big giant scythe-type blade coming out of the bottom of it, which is very reminiscent of the axe blade that was attached to Mac's shotgun in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It's one of those things that it looks cool and almost makes sense until you start to think about it in any kind of like reasonable capacity as to how useful this would be. And then you realize it's just basic comic book BS. And overall, this is kind of cool, but it would be much cooler if there was any kind of background behind them at all. I mean, this is literally just red with shades of red. Cool. Like, I mean, something, man. This is a big, giant 2-page splash image that you've done with literally no background behind it. The team immediately takes the fight to all of the enemy cyborg combatants and are easily able to outmatch them, as they're just an overwhelming elite fighting force. We see Chapel finishing off the last one by slicing its head clean in half with his knife-like thing. I call it a knife-like thing because, let's be honest, people, this is not what knives look like. And after the battle is concluded, Chapel states, "We just made short work of the best they had to offer. Now let's go find their leader." However, at this point, they are confronted directly by the evil leader, who is contacting them over some sort of PA system, and he goes by the name of Geiger. Now, we don't know anything about this character. However, we are given context clues that he and Chapel do have a past with one another as they begin to mock each other. Geiger pointing out the ridiculous face paint, as he puts it, that Chapel wears and that he should get a job with Avon. And Chapel said that, yeah, he'll do that as soon as he's done wiping the floor with Geiger's sorry butt. Kind of, this back and forth jawing that the two of them have alludes to a much deeper connection that we're not aware of at this point. Also, again, this knife, I mean, I can't even blame Jay Lee on this, despite the fact that Jay Lee has a very over-the-top stylized artwork. This is how everyone draws Chapel's knife. From the very beginning, Chapel's knife was always designed to look more like a piece of shrapnel from an airplane crash than an actual knife blade. And I'd also like to point out these long bullet straps that Chapel's wearing in this specific panel. I point them out because they haven't existed at all in any of the panels that happened on the pages before this, and they're not going to exist in any of the panels on the pages after this. Literally, they just appear out of nowhere and then immediately disappear. I don't know why they were drawn here or what Jay was doing other than thinking to himself, boy, it'd look cool if Chapel had these huge bullet straps on him. And I mean, yeah, it kind of does, but it doesn't make any sense at all. And also, what the hell is going on with these huge spikes coming out of his boots that have been throughout the entire comic? They don't make sense either. Again, this is more just a testament to Jay Lee's over-the-top style of artwork and illustration that he does. And admittedly, it does look cool under the right circumstances, but I also think sometimes he goes just a little over the top with it. As Geiger continues to taunt Chapel, he asks Chapel what he's hiding behind the mask and that he wonders exactly how far the project has sunk its teeth into him. Chapel responds by stating, "I ain't no zombie," as Geiger replies, "Well, I'm sure that can be arranged, and if I'm not mistaken, it already has been. See you amongst the unliving." Now, this is in reference to Project Born Again, which several of the members of Youngblood were part of, as we know that once they're killed, they can then be resurrected. This is, in fact, what happened with Battlestone. As the conclusion of their conversation happens, Chapel realizes that in all likelihood, the entire facility is rigged to explode, so the three men start to make their escape. However, as they're doing so, Al Simmons calls out to Duke and says, "Hey, hold up." Duke asks, "Hey, what are you doing, man? We need to get out of here. Like, there's no time to waste." And before he can continue to protest, Al raises up his pistol and shoots Duke through his mouth, blowing his brains out in the process. At this point, Al simply states, "This is what happens when you sell out your CIA brothers and the organization. And maybe next time you'll think twice before you decide to sell us up the river. Oh wait, there won't be a next time," as he continues to run, and he and Chapel barely make it out of the facility before the huge explosion happens to destroy it. Now, this is in reference to the belief that Duke is in fact the one who tipped off Cybernet and set up this trap for all three of them to get caught in, assuming that it would wind up in the deaths of Simmons and Chapel and that Duke would get some kind of huge payday. Although it does bring up the question that if Duke was part of this all along, why would he have not turned on Chapel and Al in the process and tried to aid Cybernet in defeating them? 3 days later, we are then transported to the office of Jason Wynn, where he is congratulating both Al and Chapel on a job well done. And even though this unfortunate business with Duke happened, that the mission was a success. And this is where we start to see some of the divide between Al and Jason Wynn happening in its earlier phase, as Al starts to question Wynn, stating, "Yeah, what exactly did Duke do wrong here?" And Wynn just kind of dismisses it, stating that he can't go into details about it due to security clearance, but that Duke actually had amounted a considerable amount of evidence to show that he was betraying the agency, but that they shouldn't dwell on this as it won't be to the benefit of anyone, especially not Al. Almost in a sense warning him that, hey, if you keep digging around like this, the same thing's going to happen to you. We then fast forward 5 years as Chapel recants that he had left the CIA and joined up with Youngblood and that Simmons is now dead. But he's been recently contacted by Wynn, who states, "Oh, you've been busy. You don't even seem to have time to come by and visit your old boss." And Chapel just kind of blows him off, stating, "I'm here now. You got 5 minutes." Jason hands him a folder stating, "There's a very delicate matter that I need your assistance with. And I know we didn't, exactly leave each other on the best terms, but I really feel like you're the best man for the job." At this point, Chapel interrupts and states, "You know what, Jason, just save it. I'm not coming back to work for you." Jason states that, well, before you do that, I should point out it'd be a real shame if the information about your past were to get out to your adoring public and what that might do for your image amongst the Youngblood agency. And Chapel, realizing the threat that's being given to him, immediately jumps back and threatens Wynn, stating, "It'd be a shame for the both of us, and that's something that you should remember if you ever try to threaten me again. I'm not your boy anymore," as he slams the door shut and storms out. At this point, Wynn hits the button on his intercom and asks his secretary to look through his Rolodex and find a very specific name. We then get an advertisement for Dooms 4, which I still am trying to acquire more issues of so I can do videos on it. I have like 2 random issues. And for whatever reason, I guess Dooms 4 didn't do very well or didn't print in high numbers because it seems to be very difficult to find this in dollar boxes comparatively to like other Image titles of this time period. We then get back into the story where Jason states to his secretary that he needs the name of a man called Geiger, as we find out that it wasn't Duke who betrayed the team, it was in fact Jason himself, as we see a very cool looking shattered image of Chapel behind him, and we realize that Jason has some pretty nefarious ideas about how he's going to deal with Chapel going forward, as we've reached the end of this story and it is to be continued. We then reach the Bloodlines letter section where readers can write in to ask questions and try and just give their overall praise or potential criticisms to Rob Liefeld and the gang. However, Rob basically seems to just print mostly positive letters throughout all of these, at least up until this point. However, there were a few readers that brought up some things. One of them brought up that there was a very notable lack of character development throughout the entirety of the first 4 issues of Youngblood, and that he would like to know more about the backstories of these characters and why exactly they're motivated to do and what they do and be where they are. And this is a fair point. A lot of the characters, especially when you get through like issue number 2 of Youngblood, or yeah, number 2 specifically, because they introduce so many new characters and there's just no backstory to any of them. Like, we don't know what their motivations are, why they're there. It's just all these characters being thrown at you one after another, and it's at such a breakneck speed that seems unnecessary, that we don't have time to really care about any of them. Another reader brings up that Link, who was featured in Youngblood number 0, has never been featured again in any of these comic books, which is a fair note, that you have this team member who apparently matters, but has not existed in a single issue other than just issue number 0. And Rob's response to that is just wait, he's going to show up more frequently. And then one reader brings up how he bought 2 issues of Youngblood number 4, one as an investment, which I feel really bad for that guy, because that book he paid like $2 for is now only worth like $1, at least in 2025 from when I'm recording this video. All those early issues of Youngblood are just dollar books, man. Like, none of them are worth even what their original cover price was in most circumstances. And this guy was buying, 2 books at a time, thinking that he was going to be like making all this money in the near future. And unfortunately, that's just kind of where things were in 93. That was before the crash of like the comic book industry. And everyone really did believe that magically a book that came out one month would go up in price by like $10 the very next month. And that was normal. And that comic books just immediately increased in value tenfold month to month. And of course, we know now in the future that that is absolutely not the case. And realistically, it never should have been. It was just complete overinflation of the market. And I do feel bad for people who kind of got caught with their pants down during all that. But wait, there's more. Just as we saw with issue number 1 of Youngblood, Youngblood Strikefile number 1 also has 2 separate stories. If you flip the book over, we get now a second story that features the really cool looking and very mysterious Die Hard. Now, despite the fact that this book does have a gold foil cover, that gold foil cover is only on the chapel cover. The Die Hard cover does not get the same gold foil treatment and is in fact identical on both books. Creator, writer, penciler, Rob Liefeld. Inks, Danny Miki. Color design and separations, Steve Oliff and Optics. Lettering, Kurt Hathaway. Technical assistants, George McCarthy, Paul Scott. Editor, Eric Stevenson. We are transported to 1944 in Berlin as we see the superhero team known as the Allies, who are engaging in battle against the Axis powers. Notably, we get the Golden Age Die Hard, who we can see is pretty clearly supposed to be an analog for Captain America, given the shape of his boots, the big giant red gloves, the circular shield that he carries. We also get young Super Patriot, who up until this point, I don't know if they had ever depicted him in his younger years, where he's wearing his traditional superhero costume with a big cape, no cybernetics, and is depicted as having the ability to fly in this instance. And we also get our first introduction to Glory, as this is her first appearance ever. And for those who don't know, Glory is kind of an analog for Wonder Woman. And I'd also like to point out she's wearing red gloves here because that does not remain consistent as we get further into this book. We then get a big 2-page action splash of the Allies jumping into battle against a trench full of Nazi soldiers, as the entirety of this is being narrated and recanted by Glory, stating that they gave Hitler's forces more than their fair share of headaches, as can be attested to by all of the soldiers that they were able to defeat. Notice here that Glory's gloves have already disappeared, and that Rob, I think, made a mistake in drawing this Golden Age depiction of Die Hard, where on the very first page he has a basically type of open cowl design akin to like what Cobra Commander would wear. And in this one, he doesn't, but then has like this weird little flared back part that's like flowing in the breeze, which, by the way, is not at all how this would look if Die Hard was like flying through the air with that type of a mask. I think he accidentally messed up and drew Die Hard with his modern day mask and then realized it after everything had already been inked. So he was like, okay, I'll just try and throw this little stuff behind him, and that's kind of the way I'm trying to get out of this. But it doesn't really work, let's be honest. As the team jumps into action, we do see Glory and Super Patriot flying above the battlefield as Die Hard runs forward. Glory mentioning in her storytelling that Die Hard was always a mystery man and that she even did not know what his secret identity truly was. But she always respected his ability to lead. As we see him jump into battle asking Glory if she's okay, she states that these Nazis are no match for her Amazon strength. Yes, Glory is an Amazon, just like Wonder Woman. It's as if Rob wasn't even trying to hide what he was doing, like not disguise it even a little bit. Also, we see that Die Hard's mask is still being drawn in this weird way, I think because at this point, Rob had already realized what he had done and now had to just stick with it through the rest of the story, which just makes it look like Die Hard has some weird mullet mask. It doesn't make any sense at all. And Glory continues to narrate the story, stating that Super Patriot was always a man that she was rather infatuated with, admitting that she even had a crush on him at one point, as we see him punching a Nazi soldier, flipping him end over end with his cape going very Spawn-like, but this is so that it can trail off and create a separate panel for Die Hard to be featured in, as he states, "You tell him, Super Patriot, these Nazis don't stand a chance against us," as he throws his shield, very reminiscent of Captain America once again. Although I will admit, I do like how his cape is trailing off into this second panel. This is a really creative thing to do, regardless of the fact that it doesn't make sense that Super Patriot's cape is somehow like 4 miles long now. We then get an advertisement for Deathmate Red. As I've stated in previous videos, I do have every issue of Deathmate and I will make videos on it eventually. I'm just kind of working my way up to it because it is going to be a lot to undertake, unfortunately. But don't worry, it is coming at some point in the future. We then get back into the story as we see a large whoomp sound effect. I don't know what that's supposed to be, as a ton of Nazi soldiers go flying. We then see Die Hard charging through a bunch of them and Super Patriot knocking a bunch out, as it becomes very clear that these soldiers are no match whatsoever for the Allies, as they're just running roughshod through them. And Glory continues to talk of how she doesn't really know how much of a difference their fighting made in the outcome of the war, but she was always proud of the fact that they fought for the foundation of what America was built on, which is interesting to show that she had a very high level of patriotism, despite the fact that she was not from America and she was only fighting because she truly believed in the cause of the Allies and felt like it was her duty to stand with them up against the forces of evil. Glory then recalls that no one seemed more dedicated to this cause than Die Hard himself, as we see him in a big 2-page action panel as he lands a flying drop kick that knocks out 5 enemy soldiers. Glory states, "Way to go, I bet the Fuhrer even felt that one," and even Super Patriot gets a little bit of a laugh, stating that there's no one who enjoys themselves more in fighting the Reich than Die Hard. And it does seem that Glory's admiration for Die Hard is very much on display, and that she really believed that he was dedicated to this cause with all of his being. Glory continues to recall some of the exploits of the team as they fought against Hitler's forces, stating that there were times where things were really scary, but she always felt invigorated when she was fighting alongside of her friends and comrades, and that even though she knew after the war there would be no reason for the Allies' super team to continue to exist, that she and her friends still took great pride in defending America and trying to fight for freedom during the war. We also see that her gloves mysteriously come back out of nowhere during this panel, but are gone in the very next as she deflects a bullet with a bracelet, just like Wonder Woman. We also see Super Patriot flying, holding a tank above his head, kind of having his full abilities on display here, as we realize that Super Patriot was incredibly powerful and more than a force to be reckoned with during his heyday in youth, which really puts into more perspective how devastating it was of having to understand his defeat at the hands of the Vicious Circle, and putting that into the perspective of what the general public must have felt in this world, seeing this almost bigger than life hero who fought during World War II to defend America being taken out by street level criminals on the streets of Chicago. And also we see Die Hard's mask once again being depicted as it was supposed to be throughout the entirety of this book. So at least Rob got one more chance to show it the way he intended to, and not like this where he was just trying to cover up a mistake. At least I'm assuming that's what it was. We then get an advertisement for Brigade Number 0, and if you'd like to know more about Brigade, you can check out my Brigade playlist, which, as I'm recording this video, has but 2 videos in it. This is because I am still trying to locate a copy of Brigade Number 3 from the original Brigade miniseries, and I promise, once I get that issue, I will finish the miniseries and then get into the ongoing series. But until that happens, I can't really go any further in that series because I'm not just going to skip over an issue. But please be assured, once I find it, and I will, we're going to get back into Brigade. Getting back into the story, we see our 3 heroes standing tall in the face of adversity. As Glory states, we fought for God and country and we never faltered. We then are teleported into the present where she sits across a table from Shaft and Die Hard, stating, and this brings us to today, where I have some very, very important questions to ask you, and I'm not going to leave until I get some satisfactory answers. Glory goes on to explain that the Golden Age Die Hard passed away many years ago, once again confirming that this is in fact not the same person, and that she remained close friends with Super Patriot up until he was left for dead a year ago, which is something that was spoken about during the original Savage Dragon miniseries. If you'd like to know more about that, you can check out my Savage Dragon playlist. She states that she went to the hospital to check on him and see how he was doing, but was puzzled when she found out that he wasn't at that facility and had been transported to another facility that was supposedly more capable of dealing with his terrible injuries. However, she was informed that that information was classified, and she was afraid, in fact, that he had been brought into Youngblood and subjected to Project Born Again. However, she was surprised to learn that this was not the case, and in fact, the people who had come for him were none other than Cyberdata, which she then holds up a picture showing both Shaft and Die Hard that this is what they've done to him. She then states that she's enraged by this, as she believes that Super Patriot should have been allowed to die with dignity, and instead he's now being subjected to these horrible experiments instead of being left to the grave. And she wishes for Die Hard and Shaft and the rest of Youngblood to go to Cyberdata, find Super Patriot, and get him out of there, and make the monsters who have done this to him pay for their sins. Die Hard states that he's more than willing to help her, as this is well within their jurisdiction, and that in reality, the government has been trying to find a way to go after Cyberdata for years. Unfortunately, they've always been able to manage to cover their tracks and keep up a front of them maintaining some sort of legit business status, and never actually giving the government the evidence they needed to come for them. However, now that they have captured Super Patriot and transformed him against his will, they have more than enough reason to go after them and take them down. As we see, the story is to be continued as we see Die Hard standing at the ready, having his shield appear out of nowhere, as he clearly doesn't have it in this frame. And he seems to be up to the challenge in trying to save his quote-unquote old friend, despite the fact that he's a completely different character now. We then get this 2-page centerfold pinup of Glory, which looks pretty good. Unfortunately, there's no way to take it out and put it up on your wall without destroying the book, because it would require you to remove the final page of the Die Hard story if you did that. So Either you keep it in the book and just enjoy it from time to time when you open up this issue, or you destroy the book and pull it out and put it up on your wall. And that was Youngblood Strikefile #1. Overall, I think this is actually a really interesting book as it gives us some backstory to some pretty prominent characters within the Youngblood universe. We get to see more of a little bit of what Chapel was doing when he was still working alongside of Al Simmons. And we get a lot of backstory in terms of Die Hard and by proxy Super Patriot. And we also get our first appearance of Glory. Now, the only thing I felt like was kind of weird about this was that the story featuring Die Hard was narrated entirely by Glory, which in and of itself wouldn't be that strange, except for the fact that this is, like I said, Glory's first appearance. So if you bought this book brand new in 1993, you would have had absolutely no idea or context for who Glory was or why she mattered. And she's just coming out of nowhere and suddenly being this major player in terms of her relation to Die Hard and Super Patriot. So it is kind of jarring for her to be introduced in this way. But other than that, overall, I really did enjoy this book, despite the fact that I do have a lot of criticisms about Jay Lee just basically ignoring backgrounds as a whole throughout his entire story with Chapel, which I would have been ever so slightly more forgiving of were it not for the fact that he only had to draw half of a comic book. So it really feels inexcusable that he would have completely just slacked off in such an obvious way and only drawn characters throughout his entire section. Again, I understand he has a very stylized, very detailed artwork, but at the same time, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to throw backgrounds in most of the panels if you're only drawing half of a comic book. But then again, these are all just my opinions. You may not have a problem with the lack of backgrounds. You might believe that the way Glory was introduced was A-okay and that there was no better way that they could have done that. And if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.